Africa, hosting an International Women's Day event in Johannesburg. International Women's Day celebrates the social, economic, cultural, as well as political achievements of women. It has started there. The guest speaker is at the lectern. Let's go there now live.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. I'm really humbled by this fascinating gathering. Let me start by congratulating the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa for hosting their 11th International Women's Day event. And I thank you for inviting into this esteemed convention the experience of Palestinian women, especially at this time when all Palestinians, both women and men, are in a profound need for solidarity and advocacy in their struggle for national liberation. At this difficult time, relentless efforts to annex what remains of Palestine, liquidate the cause, and normalize the occupation are going on. Africa has always extended a hand of support and solidarity to Palestinians, especially post-apartheid South Africa. Solidarity is the antidote for social and political injustices. It permits trauma recovery and liberates all involved in its path. Solidarity will not be limited to women, but will extend to all Palestinians, and its healing effect will move from Palestine to other societies fighting for freedom. Now let me share with you the stories of a few Palestinian women. How can I control where should I point this? Okay. Do you see the slides clearly, or? Yeah. So this is the map of Palestine, and we see across history that Palestine is becoming smaller and smaller. Not only there is annexation of the land, but also fragmentation of the Palestinian society. Palestinians are 13 million. 2/3 of Palestinians are dispossessed of their land, and they live abroad. And only 1/3 of Palestinians continue living on the Palestinian territories. 2 million in Gaza and 3 million in the West Bank. And this geographical fragmentation has created different social and political determinants. Social and political determinants affect health and well-being, and mostly the well-being and the health and the mental health of women. The fragmentation has created different situations. We cannot assume, in spite of the fact that Palestine is a geographically very small area, we cannot assume that the conditions of Jerusalemites is similar to the conditions of people from Gaza or people from the West Bank. And there are also Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So it's a very complex situation in a very small geographical area. This is my travel document in 2005. And you can see that my nationality is undefined. I come from Jerusalem, and Jerusalemites are citizens of nowhere in the world. The occupation of Jerusalem made of us, the natives of the city, temporary residents, which means that our residency cards are bound with certain conditions. And if we don't fulfill these conditions, our papers will be revoked very easily. And over the past 15 years, 15,000 Jerusalemites lost their identity papers due to difficult conditions with the authorities there. After some negotiations and complaints, I got a newer identity card, which refers to me as a Jordanian, but not in the eyes of Jordanians. This is only on my paper. This is Abir Abu Khdir, a neighbor in Shafat, in my neighborhood of Shafat. Abir went to prison. The accusation was interrupting the work of soldiers. She has a teenager boy. Teenagers are in a special phase of risk. Teenage is the age where people search for their identity. They are emotionally vulnerable. They cannot control their impulses. So when they are provoked by the soldiers, they can easily respond to that. They participate in gatherings and in demonstrations. Her son is one of many Palestinian minors who are provoked by the dangerous political context. He participated in a demonstration. They arrived to his home in the middle of the night with dogs, many masked-faced soldiers. They were shouting in Hebrew, and the woman reacted to that. They threatened the father not to interfere. In a few cases when fathers interfered, they were shot. The father could not interfere. The mother could not accept being stopped by the father, so she tried to protect her child. The child was arrested, and so was his mother. And this is Dareen Tatour. She's a Palestinian with an Israeli Arab citizenship, one of those remaining in the land that was occupied in 1948. And when people get anxious, what do? They talk. And they ventilate and express their emotions on social media. And this woman is a poet. And the words is her tool to express her emotions, to reach an emotional balance. So she published a poem on her Facebook, and she was arrested because that poem was esteemed by authorities as an incitement for violence. This is Zainab, a 16-year-old girl who comes to see me for her depression. Zainab was born in a car at a checkpoint. The father tried to get out of the village to drive his wife, who was in labor, but they were stopped. They were not allowed to go to the hospital. So the child was born, and there were complications, and she developed cerebral palsy. She is among many children who were born at checkpoint. In 5 years, 67 women were born, gave birth at checkpoints, and 36 babies died. Zainab survived. And this is the story of another woman, Lydia Rimawi, a hopeful story. This woman, her husband disappeared. He went behind bars for 14 years. And after 14 years, she managed to smuggle his sperm. And she gave birth to Majd. Majd is now 4-year-old. While Dareen Tatour cannot express herself on Facebook, the Israeli occupation forces spokesperson makes a post every minute to incite against Palestinians, posts in Arabic, and to wash the minds of Arabic-speaking population. In one of his posts, he commented on women who participate in the Great March of Return on the Gaza border. So he said the following: women's participation in demonstration, women's participation in, he commented on the women's participation in demonstration. He said, the bad woman who lacks honor acts wildly against her feminine nature and cares not for how she is despised in the society. And unfortunately, this idea resonates for some people. In my work, I provide help, psychological help, for ex-prisoners in groups, for men and women. And while the men feel glorified and highly esteemed by the society because of their involvement in the national struggle, women internalize the feeling of guilt because they are blamed for leaving their children. They are blamed for participating in a realm and in activities that are perceived by the society as male activities. Let me explain to you some gender differences in the face of political violence. Usually, men are faced responders, and they are the leaders too. While women take a role in the nurturing of the family, in providing emotional support, they have domesticated roles. Now, I have to say that over the years, if we compare the first Intifada and the second Intifada and nowadays in Palestine, women don't look for the approval of the party. They decide, they have more access to the internet and they decide their activities on their own. And we see more lone wolves who act on their own without any coordination with others. The other difference is that women's injuries are less visible than men's injuries. A man might receive a bullet in his knee and his leg is amputated, and everyone sees that and empathizes with that. While a woman whose son is shot and killed or arrested, she has a broken heart, but no one sees her broken heart. Political violence increases gender inequalities. Political violence destroys the capacity of men as providers and protectors. It humiliates men. It targets men. They go back home humiliated and frustrated. There is little money at home, no bread on the table. The domestic work and labor is increased for women. It creates a lot of tension. A frustrated man who cannot stand up to vertical violence will internalize that violence and will express it horizontally, which results in domestic violence. Poor economy for the family will result in the wish of many families to marry their girls off very quickly. When a young girl gets married, she is not ready to take care of her children, to stand up for any injustices. She lives in her new family. So it weakens the role of the woman in the future family. We cannot make assumptions about gender roles. There are differences according to context. Let us look at the low picture. This is a picture from the film Offside, a film about a football match, where girls disguise as boys to go and participate, to go and watch the football match in Iran. And the upper picture comes from Jerusalem. This is a boy from the West Bank. He cannot cross, especially males are difficult. It's difficult for them to cross and come to Jerusalem. So this boy had to disguise as a girl so that he can deceive the soldiers at checkpoint and cross to come to Jerusalem. We cannot understand the difficulties for women if we ignore the assumption of hyper-agency for men in Palestine. So the society expects men to be providers and protectors. So we see many young boys, especially in Jerusalem, who drop out of school because they can work as laborers. They get seduced by the possibility of earning money at an early age. So they go and work as cheap laborers for Israelis to provide money to the family so that the sisters can continue their studies. The dropout rate in Jerusalem schools is 13%. They are expected to be protectors. And young men have a difficulty controlling and postponing their urges. So they might easily find themselves provoked by the violent context, and they become the victims of that political and violent context. The vast majority of the people who were killed by the occupation, who went to prison, who are amputee, were young male, very young male. More men, the percentage of people who pass time in prison in Palestine is 20%. In each family, in every household, there is a person who spent time in prison. And maltreatment and torture are commonplace when a person is detained. The masculinity of men is targeted by the occupation. As soon as they arrest a young boy, he is kicked on his genitalia. The very first behavior of the soldiers. And then he is insulted. And in some of the research that I participated in, where we collected the narrative of boys, they explained that most of the insults, they gave us examples of the insults. In all the insults, there was a sexual connotation. In all the insults, there was a mention of the women in their household. They would ask a young boy, a young man, "What's the name of your mother?" And he would say, "Aisha." He say, "We won't leave you until you insult your mother." And then these young men live with the shame of having to do so. This is how, this is the regular check that happens in the streets of Jerusalem. So we have gendered vulnerabilities, and we have to understand the gendered vulnerabilities. Grief and loss is very common, but it is more complicated for women because it is less visible. There are circles of grief in Palestine. In Palestine, there are many households who are led by women. Research tells us that 11% of households, of families, are led by the women, not because of divorce, but because of the absence of men behind bars. The research fails to tell us about the men who are physically present but psychologically absent. They don't fulfill their role as parents and as husbands. It's a situation of historical and intergenerational trauma. So we can imagine that there are many people who are present physically but absent psychologically. Home demolition is a very common experience in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, over the past 10 years, 1,000 homes were demolished. It's an attack on the psychological space of people. United Nations grants Palestinians a refugee status. And this refugee status, if you are a man, it will go to your children. But if you are a woman refugee, this status will not be inherited by your children. There is discrepancy by United Nations when it comes to gender. Fertility rate is very high in Palestine, which makes Palestinians a very young and a very vulnerable population. Some women they perceive the occupation as a plan for ethnic cleansing, for the annihilation of the Palestinian nation. And they respond to that by bringing more children to life. But high fertility rate contributes to postnatal depression. I participated in this study where we made a longitudinal follow-up of a number of women who just gave birth. We followed them up over 6 months, and 27% of them developed depression during the first 6 months. So women, as Palestinians, they are touched and affected by the political violence. But there is also a special interest that Israeli politicians and army people have regarding women. This is a t-shirt of the Israeli occupation forces. And if you see on this t-shirt, they are targeting a woman who is pregnant. Israeli politicians describe the uterus of Palestinian mothers as a demographic bomb. And here we see that the t-shirt reads, "One shot, 2 kills." Ayelet Shaked was a Knesset member when the attack on Gaza took place in 2014. And she declared, she incited the soldiers to target the women because the little snakes, the Palestinians, she means, come from their uterus. So she asked the soldiers not to hesitate. Mordechai Kedar is an academic at Bar Ilan University. He also said at that feverish time of 2014 on Israeli radio that a Palestinian would only stop resisting if he knows that his wife and his sister will be raped. And you know what? International feminist groups were quiet about that. They didn't say anything. These things go unnoticed. The attack on the land is meant, and the olives is meant to break the hearts of people, and it matters a lot to Palestinians. The difficulty of everyday life, going to work, going to hospitals. There is no freedom of movement. They have to go through checkpoint. Many people are returned at checkpoint, so they have to find their bypass route. Women also have special capacities and achievements. I avoid the medical terminology and jargon, but let me explain this. There are differences between the brain of a man and the brain of a woman, and we cannot tell whether this is nature or nurture. There is an area that connects between the 2 lobes of the brain that is called corpus callosum. This corpus callosum is responsible for communication, and it's thicker in the minds of women. So women are very good at communication because of probably of the protecting role and the caring role that they take. Let me go to this slide and I will come back to the first one. So when a man tells a story, we often hear numbers, major events, and results. When women speak, there is nuisance. They add flesh and blood to history, delineating heroes, adding emotion to locations, and drawing meaning from events. It is thanks to this generous use of narrative details that our psychological space is widened, and we are connected to who we really are, to our ancestors, and to the land. Through the oral history, we remain bound to places that we have never seen, and to values and traditions that have been stolen. Grandmothers create the nostalgia to historical Palestine. I'm going the wrong direction in the slides. I want to go up a little bit. I don't know if I'm controlling or you're controlling, and you give me a false feeling that I'm controlling the slides. Can we go up a little bit, please? So it is said that history is written by victors, but I don't trust the written history. I trust my grandmother's stories. This is how we learn the history of Palestine. Some new Israeli historians managed to get access to classified archives. You know, the occupation, any colonization, it creates facts on the ground, and it creates the narrative that they want to spread. And they hide evidence in classified archives. And the victims of their crimes will never have access to these archives. So only a few Israeli new historians like Ilan Pape, Benny Morris, and Abraham Burg managed to release a few things from these classified archives, which show us the horrors that took place in the Nakba, in the evacuation of the Palestinian land in '48. And when the Palestinians only have access to the oral history, but they question and they reduce the credibility of that oral history. So how to render this oral history academically documented and how to give it credibility is a very important challenge for people living under oppression and occupation. This is the area of Deir Yassin, where one of the most important massacres in '48 took place. And when you go now to that piece of land, to that neighborhood, you will find the psychiatric hospital, where the Palestinian Jerusalemites are supposed to be hospitalized when they become psychotic. And you will find the Holocaust Museum, where recently the leaders of the world came and visited to commemorate the atrocities that happened in Europe to the Jews and homosexuals and other races. Now this Holocaust Museum is built on Khirbet Hamama, and no one hears of Khirbet Hamama. All the international leaders who came to visit and commemorate didn't know about the Palestinian village who existed there. So this is how history is made. This is how history is falsified and changed and manipulated. While we are hyper-amnesic to the Holocaust, we don't speak about what happened to Palestinians. let me see, no, the slide before, please. I'm a psychiatrist trained in the West, and I'm very well trained to treat individual trauma. But all what we learn in the West is not sufficient to treat the collective trauma, because the West didn't have that experience. And the vast majority of the world suffered from collective trauma. And we have to invent, we have to authenticize our work in therapy, in psychology, in psychiatry, and to invent methods to treat the collective trauma. My grandmother is not a psychiatrist, but she can treat the collective trauma because of her narrative, because of the stories that she tells. Collective healing through oral history. Women are able, through their narratives, to expose us to the past and help us to reprocess and work through our collective memories, and thus to treat our historical trauma. In their stories and capacities to relate and mentalize, women sue and repair the damaged fabric of the society and preserve the national identity of the people of Palestine. A trauma to an individual creates damage to the brain tissue, but a trauma to a society creates damage to the social fabric. The society that is traumatized becomes envious, distrustful. It internalizes a feeling of inferiority. It internalizes shame. And it has a very damaging effect for many generations to come. That's why it is very important that the project of the liberation of the mind and psychological healing should go hand in hand with the project of the liberation of the land. I have some conclusions, and then I will tell you a sad story. There are multi-layers of oppression in Palestine. A woman needs to navigate her way for freedom through different political spheres. Gender shapes vulnerabilities, but also shapes special capacities. Gender role flexibility contributes to community resilience, where women need to take the role of men sometimes, and men need to take the role of women. Women are often regarded as victims, but are usually resourceful, resilient, and maintain the social fabric of the community. Interventions to support women should be equitable, inclusive, and do no harm. There is false feminism in the world, and we should be cautious of false feminism, because false feminism maintains the status quo. It doesn't challenge the status quo. And there is also pink washing. If we talk about gender issues, pink washing. Yeah, Israel, the Palestinians are barbarians, and Israel takes care of the Palestinian LGBTQ. Analyze that, no more details, and you will understand the pink washing that lies behind. Networking and understanding the intersectionality of the struggle will synergize the work for human liberation. This is the sad story. It's a fable. It's a legendary story that I hear from my patients when they talk about the oppression that comes to them from their own society. The story says that when the soldiers went to Palestinian villages to evacuate the homes, they had to do a lot of harm and rape the women. And so they went to the home of the chief of the village and harassed his wife. They went to the baker's home and killed the daughter. They went to many, many homes until they arrived to the home of Hassan. And Hassan was a courageous and a strong woman. And she managed to kill the rapist. But unfortunately, that put the other women in shame. What would the village say? If Hassan managed to do it, why others couldn't do it? So the women convened, and they decided to kill Hassan. That's the legendary story, to warn us of the possibility that false feminism can do that for us. Thank you very much, and I end with this slide that says, don't classify me. Don't classify me, we are all the same humans. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry if I were...
Thank you very much. I would join all of you standing up at this point. Because as we've listened to Samah, I think we can relate to it. We see South Africa, we see the pain and trauma that sometimes we can't explain. Please be seated. At this particular point in time, I'd like to call the two panelists who will be joining us up front as respondents.